Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe. I came across an interesting quote from President Ezra Taft Benson that has to do with the two witnesses. And then I came across something else really interesting that has to do with experimental Jewish missions. So we're going to be talking about preaching to the Jews and the two witnesses and the times of the Gentiles and so forth. All right, so this is on page 98 and 99. The occasion was a Washington, D.C. state conference, the 3rd of March, 1957. The name of the talk was The Jews' Return to Palestine in Fulfillment of Prophecy. There is great conflict yet to come before the millennial reign, before the Christ comes. If you want to get some indication of just what this conflict will be like, you may wish to turn to the 14th chapter of Zechariah and the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation, which make it very clear that nations will be pitted against Judah, that there will be great wars, great conflict, and then here's the part right here, that at least two. Now that's really interesting. He doesn't say two. He says that at least two prophets will be raised up among them, that they will make predictions before Christ comes. Now here's another important part. I have no doubt but what these prophets will be assigned by the leadership of the priesthood, because the Lord's house is a house of order. The gospel will be carried to the Jews, and many of them will accept it. Okay, as you know, if you've been watching my channel for a while, I'm trying to be very thorough. With all these prophecies having to do with the second coming, you can't just go off the scriptures because some of the scriptures aren't very clear or they're up to interpretation. They may seem really clear to you when maybe they're not so clear to somebody else. And I feel like with some of these scriptures, you have to go to modern day prophets to understand what they mean. And even in those cases, we may not currently have a full understanding of how things are supposed to play out specifically. So I'm trying to capture as many quotes from church leadership about these various prophecies to get a better and better picture of the way that our church interprets the scriptures. And so this one is actually pretty valuable because, like I said, this part right here where it says at least two, leaving open the possibility that it may be more than just two. I have floated the idea that this may be related to the concept of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's a doctrine or a law where the Lord's word is established in the mouths of 2 or 3. So essentially not just one person, but multiple people. And I don't know. I think that there needs to be that flexibility. And it seems like that's how he interprets it, that it may not necessarily just be 2. And furthermore, that it wouldn't be some rogue element that would just rise up in Israel. Because when we think of the Jews, I think most people immediately think of the nation state of Israel, which could be true, but not all Jews are in Israel. You have the Jewish diaspora all throughout the world, with a sizable population here in the United States. So, but anyway, it doesn't seem that it would be some rogue or detached prophets that would just suddenly arise. Because I think some members of the church think that within the Jewish population itself, there would just spontaneously be these 2 prophets that would arise. And that would be true prophets, but somehow be detached from the authority of the church. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Let's go to my spreadsheet called Quotes A through Z. What's currently row 724 for 2 witnesses. And that idea is repeated by Elder Bruce R. McConkie a couple times Let's look at this one. This is Doctrinal New Testament Commentary, 1974. These two shall be followers of that humble man, Joseph Smith, through whom the Lord of heaven restored the fullness of his everlasting gospel in this final dispensation of grace. No doubt they'll be, they'll be members of the Council of the 12 or of the First Presidency of the Church. And then this quote comes from his book, The Millennial Messiah. He asks, "Who will these witnesses be? We do not know, except that they will be followers of Joseph Smith. They will hold the holy Melchizedek priesthood. They'll be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is reasonable to suppose, knowing how the Lord has always dealt with his people in all ages, that they will be two members of the Council of the 12 or of the First Presidency of the Church." All right, so I have those two from Bruce R. McConkie, this new one from, at the time, Elder Ezra Taft Benson of the Quorum of the 12 that supports that idea. And then I wanted to read a couple other things really quick. And then we're going to go on to talk about these experimental missions to the Jews. Okay, like missionary work, missionaries with badges to the Jews. We'll get to that in just a second. I always like to look at this quote from Victor L. Ludlow, Emeritus Religion Professor at BYU. This was published in Deseret News, August 26, 2010. Mid-East Prophecies Wow BYU Audience. Okay, so this is his interpretation, which may be informed by church leadership. I don't know. But it says, "When will two prophets come to the Holy Land? It's already happening. It's a common reality to people in the Middle East," Ludlow said. Ludlow tells students at BYU Jerusalem they are in the right place if they want to meet a general authority. The top place to meet one of the brethren is church headquarters. The second is Provo, specifically the Missionary Training Center. And the third is in the Holy Land. Quote, "There is something to be felt there. They see them all the time." So that kind of goes along with what Ezra Taft Benson said, how it would at least be three, it would at least be two. I've had many different theories about the two witnesses. I'm not married to any one of these theories. I'm just thinking of possibilities. I have thought about Joseph and Hyrum Smith being the two witnesses. I'm not going to go into that whole thing right now. It's too much for me to cover in this video. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were. But if they're not, I've thought about this spreadsheet that I put together. I'm actually going to change it. I think I'm going to turn this into kind of like how I have this new spreadsheet for church history. And then I have a second one for church history specifically in Missouri. I'm thinking of converting this into church history with the Jews, with Israel and the Jews. That's probably what I'm going to do. But at the moment, it's called Prophets Travel. I initially wanted to kind of like answer this question. Have we already had a lot of prophets interacting with the Jews and preaching to them or establishing relationships with them, building bridges? And on my timeline, the first item that I have is back in 1841 when Elder Orson Hyde was sent to the Holy Land, and on the Mount of Olives, he dedicated the Holy Land for the return of the Jews. This is why the Jews, after this point, started to return to the land. It's because of this special mission that was given to Orson Hyde. So he did that, and then there were subsequent dedications of the land by other apostles. He wasn't the only one. We have President George A. Smith, first counselor in the First Presidency, along with Elder Lorenzo Snow and Elder Albert Carrington, who went in 1873. I have this one that I just added. It comes from a quote that I already had from President John Taylor. I don't know the exact year when he had this meeting with Baron Rothschild, who is a Jew, but he was talking to him all about the need for the Jews to return to the land and for them, excuse me, in this quote, for them, the Jews, to build the temple. And he talked to him about the purpose of temples. They talked about the Salt Lake Temple. Okay. So this is the first one that I have on here where you have an apostle who is essentially talking to a Jew about doctrine and about our beliefs. This quote comes from 1876, but it could have been like the actual conversation could have been from, a year or two earlier or more. So anyway, got that. Here I have a Missouri visit. I'm going to have to move this to my church history in Missouri spreadsheet. Another dedication of the land for the return of the Jews by Elder Ianthon H. Lund. And then got these three items, Elder Francis M. Lyman. Okay. And I'm not going to go through all these, but there were multiple dedications of the land. Here's a few more in the 1920s and 1930s. Here we have in 1961, Elder LeGrand Richards, who met with top officials, quote unquote, in Israel. Here's my source over here, the David O. McKay Diaries. President Harold B. Lee, he went to go visit the Holy Land, and undoubtedly he had contact with Jewish people there as part of his trip. 1979, there was the dedication of the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden, which I don't know if there were any Jews in attendance, but it was President Spencer W. Kimball. And even if there weren't any Jews in attendance, no doubt there's been many Jews who have visited this memorial garden. It's on the Mount of Olives, of all places. There's not a whole lot of real estate on the Mount of Olives, relatively speaking, and we have this memorial there. How many Jews have seen that? And then we had the BYU Jerusalem Center, and obviously there would have been a lot of contact between our church and Israeli officials. We have President Howard W. Hunter, Elder James E. Faust involved in that. Also, Jeffrey R. Holland, who at the time was president of BYU. Here's Gordon B. Hinckley going to the Holy Land a couple times, 1996, 1999. And then I have all of these more recently. Elders Anderson, Holland, Renlund, President Nelson, Bednar, Cook, Uchtdorf, Stevenson, Gong, all of them having contact with the Jews, either going to Israel, physically going there, or just meeting with prominent Jews. In a couple cases, with prime ministers. So in 2016, President Holland and Elder Cook, they met with, okay, I got it here somewhere. They met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the mayor of Jerusalem in this picture. Okay, two prophets right here meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel. Go back. Where to go? Go back to this. And then the Prime Minister of Argentina, Javier Milei. He wasn't born a Jew, but he converted to Judaism, and the church has had contact with him. And there's just been like all these times, okay? There's been a lot of contact between our prophets and apostles and the Jews. Sometimes in Israel itself, other times here in the United States or in other countries. In this case, the UK, and this one in Greece, Argentina, another one in Argentina. Okay, so when Ezra Taft Benson says that at least two prophets will be raised up among them, that's probably more accurate than some would think. That it's not strictly two. That since the beginning of this dispensation, I don't know who the first Jew was who had the gospel preached to them, but since that time until now, maybe the entire thing is the two prophets. It's just simply preaching the gospel by the mouth of two or three, witnesses. Let's see. Okay. I had kind of remembered this. I don't know when I came across this the first time, but I was reading somewhere where the church had experimented with missions to the Jews. And thankfully, we have this paper or article that was written. This is BYU's premier academic journal. What is it? Brigham Young University Studies. This is titled "A Survey of LDS Proselyting Efforts to the Jewish People." This is by Arnold H. Green. And I'm going to have to go through this with a fine-tooth comb and add it to my spreadsheets, like all the key dates here. But the part that there's a couple parts I want to focus on. So this section is Israel becomes a state, May of 1948. And then it says, it wasn't long before eager saints began to conclude that the day had at last arrived when the process of teaching the gospel should be directed away from the Gentiles back to the lineage of Israel. Quote unquote, "It is my sincere prayer," confided BYU instructor Lynn M. Hilton, who had earlier attempted to form an organization to prepare Mormons for Jewish proselyting, "that we will not be as reluctant to take the gospel from the Gentiles and give it to Israel as Peter was reluctant to do the converse in the meridian of time. It would seem to me," suggested Apostle LeGrand Richards in 1954, "that the times of the Gentiles are now fulfilled to the point where we should carry the message to this chosen branch of the house of Israel." So I have some quotes that have to do with the times of the Gentiles, and I don't think that this is something that we're waiting to be fulfilled necessarily. There's two things, okay? There's two things. Number one, well, let's do it like this. So number one, we have a quote from President Brigham Young where he says, Jerusalem is not to be redeemed by our going there and preaching to the inhabitants. It will be redeemed by the high hand of the Almighty. And essentially what he says is that when Christ comes to them during the second coming, during his appearance to them on the Mount of Olives, that's when there's going to be a conversion event. And I don't think that all Jews are going to be converted all at once. At that point, there probably will be missionary work that's initiated among the Jews. So we have to keep that in mind. But if we go back here, we're talking about the time of the Gentiles. There's two parts of the time of the Gentiles. One has to do with the preaching of the gospel, right? When Christ came in his dispensation, the gospel was first brought to the Jews, and then afterwards it was taken to the Gentiles. In the last days, it's reverse. It's first going to the Gentiles, meaning the actual Gentiles, as well as scattered Israel, who have essentially become Gentiles because of losing our identity and becoming part of the nations. First going to that group, and then later going to the Jews. But it also has to do with who possesses the land of Israel, Palestine, but more particularly Jerusalem. So during the time of the Gentiles, Jerusalem would be trodden underfoot by the Gentiles, but then that would come to an end, and then Israel, or the Jews, would possess the land again, and that's essentially happening right now. I feel like 1967 was a key year because that's when Israel captured Jerusalem itself. I think that part is now done. Now it's in possession of the Jews. Okay, President Ezra Taft Benson. This is BYU devotional, April 14th, 1981. Prepare yourselves for the great day of the Lord. He says, we will know when the times of the Gentiles are approaching fulfillment by these signs. And then he lists different signs of the times from Doctrine and Covenants in Matthew 24. And then he says, are we not witnessing the fulfillment of these signs today? So you guys, I don't think that we're waiting for a moment to come where it's like, okay, the times of the Gentiles have been completed. It's officially been said. Now we're going to start sending our missionaries to Israel or something like that. And there's one more thing I want to point out. I should have pulled this up when I was preparing the video. But let's look at my spreadsheet called Timeline Phrases. This is a tally of the number of General Conference talks by year that include these words and phrases. And if we go to the end of my spreadsheet and we look for the phrase times of the Gentiles, we have not seen that phrase in General Conference since 1977. Before 1977, you would see it every now and again, sometimes twice in a year. But all of a sudden, after 1977, you don't see it at all. So I feel like that's a big indication that maybe the time of the Gentiles is, at an end, or it's come to a close. Not that we're going to stop doing missionary work, but we're probably in that time really close to the second coming where there's going to be this big transition. Okay, so back to this. Okay. Later in a general conference, Elder Richards encouraged, I have in my heart a feeling that it will not be long until the presidency of the church will feel to open up missionary work among these people. End quote. Perhaps in anticipation of such proselyting, Elder Richards had compiled some information on both Jewry and Mormondom, arranging it so as to impress the former with the latter's theology. In 1954, he published his compilation as Israel, Do You Know?, whose thesis suggests that the Ephraimite saints currently administer the redeeming knowledge possessed anciently by their Jewish cousins. Quote, the gospel was restored in these latter days to the seed of Joseph, he explained, and they have the responsibility of carrying it to the Jews. End quote. Although the other general authorities were evidently reluctant to call a halt to the times of the Gentiles, they agreed to let Elder Richards set up experimental, quote-unquote, Jewish missions in a few areas. Okay, so there's a section here titled Jewish Mission in Southern California. And it says it was the largest Jewish mission developed. And then later on, Utah Jewish missions. And then there's this paragraph right here. While Apostle Richards organized the Jewish missions in the West, the LDS stakes in New York and Washington, D.C. launched similar movements. In New York City, a pair of Jewish Mormons were commissioned by stake authorities to approach the Jewish community. One of these, Dr. Ivan H. Cohen, which that's interesting because if you're Jewish and you have the last name of Cohen or Kohen or things that sound like that, then you're most likely of the lineage of Aaron. You're a Jewish priest. You're one of the Kohanim. So Dr. Irving H. Cohen authored an 82-page pamphlet entitled Jews of the Torah, 1957 and 1963, which attempts to demonstrate that modern Jewry has deviated from its Old Testament prototype and that Jesus was indeed the Jewish Messiah. Dr. Cohen and Albert Solomon employed the booklet as their guide for explaining Mormonism to Jews and as the introductory reading material for Jewish investigators. Cohen, whose special mission ended in 1962, has been influential in the conversations of several Jewish persons to Mormonism. And then Jewish missions disbanded. In March 1959, the LDS First Presidency directed that henceforth all proselyting efforts to Jews should be channeled through existing state missionary organizations, thus discontinuing the experimental Jewish missions. Now, isn't it interesting, though, that as the church was contemplating this, they weren't thinking necessarily about sending missionaries to Israel. Again, not all Jews live in Israel. And I think that's what people immediately think when they think about the prophecy of the two witnesses. They think that it has to be in Israel. Because there is this part in those scriptures where it's talking about, the battle of Gog and Magog and Armageddon. I have said a number of times, how do you know that Israel has not been protected by these prophets as they meet privately in the Salt Lake Temple? How do you know okay. A lot of times, for example, the War of Independence, right after Israel was declared a sovereign state, that war a lot of times has been described as miraculous, that it was a miracle that they were able to defend themselves and not immediately be destroyed, right? How do you know that wasn't because of whoever the president of the church was at that time, or with any of its other existential wars, like you had the 6-Day War and you had the Yom Kippur War after that. Both of those were existential wars, and potentially this war or these wars, which feels kind of like it's just one big war since October 7th of 2023. How do you know that Israel hasn't been destroyed because of what the president of the church has done or petitioned the Lord for to protect them? Does that make sense? So anyway, I think it's interesting that when they were thinking, okay, the time of the Gentiles might be over, it wasn't necessarily about sending missionaries to Israel, but missionaries to the Jews that were here in the United States. So I think that's really interesting. The last thing I want to point out, and I'm not going to read this, but we've already read this before on the channel. But in 2016, when President Jeffrey R. Holland and Elder Cook went to rededicate the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden on its 175th anniversary, he spoke to this Jewish delegation at the BYU Jerusalem Center. And you can read this, it's not too long. But essentially, it was almost kind of like a missionary lesson from an apostle to these prominent Jews. He says, note this prophecy in the Book of Mormon, our sacred record, which is Semitic in its origin. And it talks about the gathering together of the Jews. So he talks about the Book of Mormon. He tells them that our church represents a remnant of the tribe of Joseph, principally, with our patriarchal lines going back principally to Ephraim and Manasseh. He informs them that there are modern day prophets. He talks about Joseph Smith. He talks about the first temple built in this dispensation, the Kirtland Temple, and how there were a series of Old Testament prophets that came to that temple. He told them that Elijah came to the Kirtland Temple, and he reads that prophecy. He mentions the fact that now there's 152 temples at the time that he gave this talk. And then he told them that Moses appeared as well. So not just Elijah, but also Moses in the Kirtland Temple. And he restored the keys that the church is currently using to gather Israel throughout the world. Then he talks about Orson Hyde's 1841 mission and how that essentially is what made possible the return of the Jews to the land. He tells them that we feel a brotherhood with you. And then we believe the work of modern Elder Orson Hyde has played a key role in God choosing Jerusalem again in the fullness of times. So anyway, he talks to them about all these like key concepts, things that are important to everybody, but this was a talk that was tailored to the Jews, things that they would find particularly interesting, that they are talked about in the Book of Mormon, that we have prophets again, that there is a temple again, because they're still waiting for the temple to be built in Jerusalem. They're still waiting for Elijah to return. And here we have President Holland that told them that all these things have taken place. So anyway, that's pretty much all that I have. So we have this new quote from Ezra Taft Benson. I've added it to my spreadsheet, and I'm just trying to be as thorough as possible and collect as much as I can. But that's going to be it for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.